Are you both in frame? Excellent. Okay, let's do it. Let me know when it's on. Okay, so thanks for having this conversation with me. I thought it was really interesting when you said that Der Straighten was a separate, distinct technique, and that did send me back to the book looking at it. So I think that's very interesting. I'd like to share what we've been doing and some thoughts about some thoughts that I had on your interpretation. So it looked to me, if we're doing it from the Siege of Second Ward, that you were doing Der Straighten like this. My partner comes in the Siege of Second. So, Siege of Second. Yep. So, partner comes in the Siege of Second. I go here, they respond, and then you cast the sword downward. Oh, let's leave that down. There we go. Cast the sword downward, and then cut over the buckler. And my concern was that we don't control their buckler, and so all that takes is a lift and a punch, and then my hand is broken. So I was worried about that. And then the other thing I was worried about is if we're fighting someone who really fights those binds. I've got a younger student who's 15 who really fights against the overbinds, and if he decides to fight it, I can't force him all the way down. And so if my opponent comes in and we bind and they really lift against this and fight, then there's probably not much casting that sword down to be found. So that concerned me. So I'd like to show how we've been doing this. Let's switch sides so that my buckler's at a better angle. So we'll start with 9V, the Siege of Second Ward. So I'm in second, my partner comes in with the siege, and then I adopt whatever this position is from the book, and they respond maybe with a thrust, maybe with a cut. Okay. We shift them outward a little bit. We don't break this 90-degree angle. Shift them outward a little bit. And then the buckler comes from underneath, rim into the edge of the sword, turn, drive into their buckler, create this gap, and cut it. So let's do that a little bit higher speed. Let's do that a little bit higher speed. Okay. And that's how it looks. And so I like that because it does control both their sword and their buckler. And then it also works from half shield. So if I'm in half shield and my opponent is doing fall under sword and shield, so grab whatever ward you want. Okay, I siege in half shield. They thrust at my head between the sword and the shield. Okay, we're here, I parry with the bind of the priest. Come from underneath, drive, create the gap between the sword, shield, and head, and then cut the gap. Let's do that a little bit faster. So here we go, I go half shield. And so that's the pass-through that we've been doing. I really prefer the word Derstreet over Derstred, because I like the interpretation of pass-through rather than tread-through. I think it's more descriptive. So that's the way I've been doing it. Yeah, so where we really differed is I've been using Derstreet as any time there's separation of the sword and buckler. So that could be separation of the sword and buckler from each other, and then you just drive through the gap. Or that could be separation of sword and buckler from the body, if they're too far out. Or it could be separation of the sword and buckler from the head, if they're too far down. And so if you apply that principle universally, then there's like 14 times that it comes up. But it is only named, I think, 4 times in the book. So looking at those real quick, we've got the one from 9V, which we already went over. We've got the one from the first play, which is I get into a left underbind. So I'm going to toss me into a left underbind. And then the book gives us things to do if we're close, if we're far, and then if their buckler is in good position or if their buckler is in bad position. So if their buckler is in bad position, creating this gap, then I thought when it said "der Street," then to go just drive through the gap of the weapons. We also see this in right overbind. So I'm here in right overbind, and in that picture, their opponent is separating the sword and buckler from their body. So this time you're too extended, and then they just lift and thrust underneath. And then we also see it after the Nukin. Nukin I've been doing a little bit differently as well. So Nukin, we're in left overbind. I do a action of the sword to the head with a short edge, forcing them to block solely with their buckler. They have no other choice other than to hit in the head. And then that creates a gap, and you drive through the gap. If I do this and they parry and I'm lazy and I linger, then we can get this like trapped position in between their arms. So it's important to make that nice and snappy so my sword doesn't get trapped. Okay, so those were the 4 times that I've been using it in the book, and then I've extrapolated into other parts where there's separation of sword and buckler. And then lastly, I know that this caused some confusion earlier because I'm doing fall under the sword and shield differently. So let's look at how I'm doing fall under sword and shield. So if my opponent is in any word they want, and then, yeah, you're in any word you want, and then I siege and half shield, we'll do fall under sword and shield. So my opponent will want to attack me at my weakest point, which is driving a thrust in between my sword and buckler, at the head. I've got 2 options. I can seize the head like a commoner, and then my opponent does the thrust knock, the Schildschlag, just like so. Or my second option is I bind point upwards, what I call the bind of the priest. Buckler floats a little bit low so that my abdomen is protected from a thrust from the chain shrew. And then my opponent does fall under sword and shield, chain shrew, aiming up at the head. And then I come here and I rebind. I know that's a very unusual description in HEMA. I like it because it works from any word position. So if you grab half shield, it works from first ward just the same as it works from second ward and from third ward. And then it applies universally to all words, which I find really convenient. So yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. I hope that clears it up. And I'm interested to see what you think of Der Streiten being a guiding principle of anytime there's a gap between the sword and shield, or what you think about Der Streiten as being a isolated, named, very specific technique. Thank you.